Both seats are completely self-storing, easily folded down or up, with no seat cushions or backs to remove or install.
Do you remember reaching for a button, a knob, or a lever that today's drivers wouldn't even recognize? Cars used to be full of strange, clever, and sometimes baffling features. Today we're exploring 20 mysterious car features that completely vanished, and the surprising reasons they disappeared. Let's start with vent windows. Those small triangular panes of glass mounted at the front edge of the door windows, the ones you'd pivot open with a little chrome latch. Old-timers called them wing windows or ventiplanes, and before air conditioning became common, they were the best climate control money could buy. Crack one open, and it would scoop fresh air directly onto your face at highway speed without the roar and buffeting of a fully open window. Smokers loved them too because they pulled cigarette smoke straight out of the cabin. They first appeared in the early 1930s, and by the 1950s, virtually every American car had them. So what killed them? General Motors fired the first shot in 1968, introducing what it called astroventilation, a flow-through fresh air system that let designers delete the vent window entirely. The real reasons were less glamorous. A one-piece door glass was cheaper to build, quieter at speed, and by the 1970s, factory air conditioning was spreading fast. There was one more problem nobody advertised. Thieves discovered vent windows were the easiest way into a locked car. Pop the latch with a screwdriver, and you were in. By the mid-1980s, they were gone from almost everything. The foot-operated dimmer switch. Here's one that genuinely confuses younger drivers when they climb into a classic car. Where's the high beam control? It's not on the steering column, it's on the floor. From 1927 all the way into the 1980s, American cars put the headlight dimmer switch on the floorboard up in the left corner where your foot could stomp it, click, high beams on. Click again, back to low, and honestly, it made a lot of sense. Your hands never left the wheel, and your left foot wasn't doing anything anyway on an automatic. Millions of drivers developed the muscle memory, tapping that button without a single conscious thought. So why did it disappear? Blame the imports and blame the carpet. European and Japanese cars used column stocks, and as they flooded the American market in the 1970s, buyers got used to the stock. Meanwhile, the floor switch had real problems. It sat in the wettest, dirtiest spot in the whole car, where snow, salt, and mud dripped off your boots, and the switches corroded and failed constantly. By 1991, when Ford finally moved the last of its trucks over, the floor dimmer was history. Plenty of old-timers still reach for it with their left foot. The in-car record player, that's right, a record player in a moving automobile. In 1956, Chrysler introduced the Highway Hi-Fi, a slide-out turntable mounted under the dash of Dodges, DeSotos, Chryslers, and Imperials. It was developed by Peter Goldmark of CBS Laboratories, the same man who helped create the LP record, and it played special 7-inch discs that spun at an ultra-slow 16 2/3 RPM, squeezing about 45 minutes to an hour of music onto a side. The needle pressure was cranked up so the record wouldn't skip over bumps, and in demonstrations it worked surprisingly well. The problem? Those special records, you couldn't play your own 45s, and the catalog was tiny, mostly show tunes and classical selections from Columbia. The option cost around $200, roughly $2,300 in today's money, and warranty claims piled up as needles chewed through discs on rough roads. Chrysler quietly dropped it by 1959. RCA tried again in 1960 with a changer that stacked 14 regular 45s, and it fizzled too. Imagine explaining to a teenager today that before streaming, before CDs, before even 8 tracks, Detroit genuinely tried to put a phonograph in the glove box area. Hard to believe, right? The manual choke. Cold mornings used to require actual skill. Before you turned the key on a carbureted car, you reached for a knob on the dash marked CHOKE and pulled it out. That cable closed a plate on the carburetor, richening the fuel mixture so a cold engine would catch and run. Pull it too little and the engine wouldn't start. Pull it too much and you'd flood it, filling the cylinders with raw gas, and then you'd sit there smelling fuel and waiting. Every car had its own personality. Your father knew that the family wagon needed half choke and 2 pumps of the pedal on a frosty morning, and that knowledge was passed down like a family recipe. Automatic chokes, using a heat-sensitive coiled spring, started appearing back in the 1930s and took over most American cars by the 1960s, though plenty of imports and budget models kept the manual knob into the early 1980s. What truly buried the choke was electronic fuel injection, which spread through the entire industry in the 1980s and simply measured the air and squirted the right amount of fuel. Curb feelers If you're of a certain age, you can hear this one, a thin metallic scraping sound as the car eased toward the curb. Curb feelers were flexible steel wires or coiled springs mounted low on the passenger side fenders, and their job was simple. When the wire scraped the concrete, it sang out a warning, telling you to stop steering before your white wall tires ever touched the curb. And in the 1950s, that mattered. Wide white walls were the pride of the neighborhood, and scuffing one on a curb was genuine heartbreak, not to mention the cost of replacing it. Fancy wheel covers and long, low bodywork were expensive to scrape, too. For a couple of dollars at the auto parts store, feelers were cheap insurance, and they became especially beloved on big Cadillacs, Buicks, and anything wearing fender skirts. So where did they go? White walls faded out through the 1970s and 80s. Cars got shorter and easier to place, and rubber curb strips on modern alloy wheels never caught on the same way. The push-button transmission, no shift lever at all. Just a neat little pod of buttons on the dash, usually to the left of the steering wheel, marked R and D 2 and 1. Chrysler introduced push-button control for its Torque Flight automatic in 1956, and for 8 years, Plymouths, Dodges, DeSotos, Chryslers, and Imperials shifted gears at the touch of a finger through a simple cable system that proved remarkably reliable. Packard offered its own electric version, and Edsel famously put its teletouch buttons right in the center of the steering wheel hub, which sounded futuristic and worked terribly. Drivers either loved the buttons or found them baffling, and valet parking attendants across America dreaded them. The end came from Washington and from standardization. Safety advocates wanted every automatic in America to follow the same familiar PRNDL pattern so drivers couldn't hop into an unfamiliar car and slam it into reverse by mistake. Chrysler saw the writing on the wall and dropped the buttons after the 1964 model year. Hey, here's the twist. Push-button shifters have quietly come back on many modern cars because electronic transmissions don't need a mechanical lever anymore. Everything old is new again. Hidden headlights. Few features made a car feel more mysterious than headlights that slept beneath the bodywork. The idea goes all the way back to the stunning Cord 810 of 1936, whose lights cranked up out of the fenders by hand. But the golden age came later. The 1963 Corvette Stingray, the 1966 Dodge Charger, the 1967 Camaro RS with its hideaway grille, and later the Firebird Trans Am, the Mazda Miata, and the Toyota Supra all winked at the world through pop-up or concealed lamps. Designers loved them because sealed beam headlight regulations forced every car to use the same clunky round or rectangular lamps, and hiding them kept the nose smooth and low. So what happened? Regulations changed in 1984 to allow modern shaped composite headlights, which meant designers could style the lamps themselves and no longer needed to hide anything. Meanwhile, pop-up mechanisms were heavy, expensive, prone to the dreaded one-eye wink when a motor failed, and European pedestrian safety standards made hard flip-up edges a liability. Fender skirts. There was a time when covering your rear wheels was the height of elegance. Fender skirts, removable panels that closed off the rear wheel openings, appeared in the 1930s and turned everyday sedans into streamlined dream machines. Stylists claimed aerodynamic benefits, and there was a little truth to that, but mostly it was about the look, that long, low, unbroken line from headlight to taillight. By the 1950s and 60s, skirts were practically mandatory on a proper luxury car. Cadillacs, Lincolns, Packards, and big Mercurys wore them proudly, and lowrider culture later embraced them as essential style. But skirts came with headaches. You had to remove them, usually with a latch or a couple of bolts, just to change a flat tire or rotate the wheels. And they trapped salty road grime against the metal, quietly breeding rust in the wheel wells. As tastes shifted towards sporty open-wheel looks in the late 1960s and 70s, skirts started reading as old-fashioned. Cadillac, loyal to the end, kept them on the Fleetwood Brougham all the way until 1996, one of the last factory fender skirts ever offered on an American car. Front bench seats, 3 across in the front. That was normal for generations of Americans. The front bench seat meant grandma could ride between mom and dad. It meant 6 passengers in a family sedan. And let's be honest, it meant your sweetheart could slide across and sit right next to you at the drive-in, which is why some folks called the middle spot the sweetheart seat. Column shifters and foot-operated parking brakes existed largely to keep that front floor wide open. At its peak, virtually every full-size American car offered a bench, often upholstered in cloth so soft it felt like a living room sofa. The decline was slow but relentless. Bucket seats and center consoles arrived with the sporty car craze of the 1960s, and by the 1990s, buyers wanted cup holders, storage bins, and armrests more than a sixth seat. Safety played its part too, since a middle passenger with a lap belt fared poorly in crash tests. The last American car sold with a front bench was the 2013 Chevrolet Impala. When it went out of production, an unbroken tradition stretching back to the very first automobiles quietly ended, and nobody in Detroit even held a funeral. Swivel seats. Now here's one that sounds like a luxury car feature from the future, and it came out in 1959. Chrysler offered swivel front seats on its Imperial, New Yorker, and other full-size models. Seats that rotated outward toward the door when you opened it, letting you sit down like a civilized human being, and then swing yourself in to face the road. Early versions even worked automatically, triggered by opening the door. Advertisements showed women in dresses entering gracefully, and honestly, the feature made real sense in an era of low-slung cars and formal clothing. General Motors revived the idea in the mid-1970s, offering swivel bucket seats in mid-size coupes like the Chevrolet Chevelle Laguna, the Monte Carlo, and the Oldsmobile Cutlass from 1973 to 1977. So why don't we have them anymore? Cost, complexity, and crash safety. If these are bringing the memories flooding back, you are exactly who we make these for. Do us one small favor and subscribe, so the next trip down memory lane finds you. That is all we ask. Now back to it, the hidden gas cap. Filling the tank on certain classic cars was a treasure hunt. Where's the filler? Behind the license plate. That's right, on millions of Chevrolets, Fords, and Cadillacs from the 1950s through the 1970s, the license plate flipped down on a spring-loaded hinge to reveal the gas cap hiding behind it. Other cars got even sneakier. On the 1956 and 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the filler hid behind the left taillight trim, and you had to know exactly which piece of chrome to swing aside. Cadillac famously tucked fillers under spring-loaded taillight assemblies in its tail fins, a party trick owners loved showing off at the gas station. Designers did this for a clean look, keeping the bodywork smooth and uninterrupted, and a center-mounted filler meant you could pull up to a pump on either side. So why did it end? Safety and fumes. Rear center fillers fed tanks that sat vulnerable in rear-end collisions, and federal crash and evaporative emissions standards through the 1970s pushed fillers to the safer rear quarter panels with sealed caps. Today, the little arrow on your fuel gauge does the remembering for you, but back then, knowing where the gas went was insider knowledge. The Artronic eye. Sitting on the dashboard of a 1950s Cadillac or Oldsmobile, you might spot a strange little chrome cylinder aimed at the road, looking for all the world like a tiny ray gun. That was the Artronic eye, introduced by General Motors in 1952, and it was an automatic headlight dimmer decades ahead of its time. Inside that pod was a photo tube that watched for the glow of oncoming headlights. See a car coming, and it automatically dropped your high beams to low. Once the road went dark again, the high beams came back on by themselves. In the 1950s, this was pure science fiction made real, and GM marketed it hard as futuristic courtesy, your car being polite to strangers automatically. The trouble was it was a vacuum tube gadget in a vibrating, temperature-swinging environment. It could be fooled by streetlights, reflective signs, even a bright moon, and repairs weren't cheap. It lingered as an option into the late 1980s under names like Guidematic and Twilight Sentinel's high beam cousin, then quietly disappeared. Here's the punchline. Automatic high beams are now standard equipment on countless new cars using cameras instead of tubes. GM had the right idea in 1952. The technology just needed 70 years to catch up. Motorized automatic seatbelts. If you drove an economy car in the late 1980s or early 1990s, you remember this one probably not fondly. You'd sit down, close the door, turn the key, and a little motor would whir to life, dragging the shoulder belt along a track in the door frame until it wrapped itself across your chest like a robotic hug you never asked for. These were passive restraints born from a federal mandate that phased in starting with the 1987 model year, requiring cars to protect front occupants automatically, without the driver doing anything. Automakers had two choices: install expensive airbags or install these motorized mouse belts, and most chose the belts because they were cheaper. Volkswagen had actually pioneered a passive belt on the Rabbit back in 1975. The problem was that the automatic part only covered your shoulder, you still had to buckle the lap belt manually, and millions of people didn't, which made the system arguably worse than a normal belt. The belts also trapped people in minor emergencies and jammed with age. Rear-facing station wagon seats. Ask anyone who grew up in the 1960s or 70s about the way back and watch their face light up. Full-size station wagons like the Ford Country Squire, the Chevrolet Kingswood, and the Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser offered third-row seats that faced backward. Out the tailgate glass. and that's where the kids rode. You'd wave at the drivers behind you, make faces at truckers hoping for an air horn blast, play cards on the floor, and watch the road unspool in reverse for 500 miles. Some wagons, like Chryslers, even faced the third row passengers toward each other. Seatbelts back there were an afterthought, and on hot days the rear glass turned the way back into a greenhouse, but nobody cared. It was the best seat in the house. What killed it was the death of the great American wagon itself, murdered in the 1980s and 90s by the minivan and then the SUV, both of which faced every seat forward. Safety experts also grew uneasy about seating children closest to a rear-end impact. Cigarette lighters and ashtrays, whether or not anyone in the family smoked, every car had them, and usually not just one. A push-in electric lighter in the dash, a sliding or flip-out ashtray up front, ashtrays set into the rear door panels or the backs of the front seats, sometimes 4 or 5 ashtrays in a single sedan. That's how universal smoking was in mid-century America, where roughly 42% of adults smoked in 1965. The lighter itself was a small marvel, a coil that glowed cherry red in about 20 seconds and popped out when ready, and every kid was warned exactly once not to touch it. Then the country changed. Smoking rates fell decade after decade, and by the early 1990s, automakers noticed most ashtrays were being used for coins, gum wrappers, and parking stubs. Chrysler began making them optional equipment, other makers followed, and the delete became the default. The lighter socket survived in disguise, relabeled as a 12-volt power outlet for phone chargers and radar detectors, and even that is now giving way to USB ports. Opera windows. If you owned a personal luxury coupe in the 1970s, your car almost certainly had them. Small, fixed, usually oval or rectangular windows set into the rear roof pillar, often framed in chrome and paired with a padded vinyl roof. Opera windows were pure theater, a callback to the carriage windows of 1930s limousines, and Detroit went absolutely wild with them. The Ford Thunderbird, Lincoln Continental Mark IV, Chrysler Cordoba, Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and countless others wore opera windows as a badge of elegance, sometimes with an opera lamp, a little decorative light glowing beside them. Functionally, they did almost nothing. They let a sliver of light into the back seat and gave the huge blind spot of a fat C-pillar the tiniest relief. But function was never the point. The point was pulling up to the restaurant looking like old money. The opera window's death was swift and total. The fuel crises pushed design toward aerodynamics, and by the mid-1980s, wind tunnel-shaped cars had no place for a chrome ring porthole and a padded landau roof. The T-tops, half convertible, half coupe, all attitude. T-tops were removable glass or smoked panels over each front seat, split by a central bar, and they gave you open-air motoring without giving up the body strength of a fixed roof. The first factory T-top arrived on the 1968 Chevrolet Corvette, but the feature exploded into legend in 1977 when Burt Reynolds ran from Sheriff Buford T. Justice in a black and gold Pontiac Trans Am and Smoky and the Bandit. Sales of T-top Trans Ams went through the roof, so to speak, and through the late 70s and 80s, you could get T-tops on Camaros, Firebirds, Corvettes, Mustangs, Nissan 300X, and even some very unlikely family cars. Everyone who owned them remembers the same two things: the glorious feeling of sun overhead on a summer night and the leaks. The panels squeaked, rattled, whistled, and let rainwater trickle onto your jeans, and stolen T-top panels became a genuine crime wave. Stiffer safety standards, better convertibles, and sunroofs that didn't need to be stored in the trunk all chipped away at the idea. When the Camaro and Firebird died in 2002, factory T-tops died with them. Would you bring them back tomorrow if you could? We read every single comment. The power antenna, turn the key, switch on the radio, and a gleaming chrome mast would rise from the fender with a soft electric whir like the car was waking up and stretching. The power antenna was one of those small luxuries that made an ordinary moment feel special, and from the 1950s through the 1980s it marked a car as a cut above. Cadillacs, Lincolns, and well-optioned family sedans retracted their antennas when you shut things down, protecting the mast from vandals and car washes, which mangled countless fixed antennas in their spinning brushes. Of course, the mechanism had a famous weakness. Inside was a motor and a long plastic tooth cable, and when that cable stripped, the antenna froze halfway, grinding pitifully every time you started the car, and the repair often cost more than the radio was worth. So what replaced it? First, short fixed rubber masts. Then engineers learned to print antennas invisibly into the rear window glass and rear spoilers, And finally, the little shark fin appeared on the roof, handling AM, FM, satellite radio, and GPS all at once. The full-size spare tire opened the trunk of almost any car built before the 1980s, and you'd find a fifth wheel, a real one, the same size as the other four, mounted on a matching rim and ready for duty. A flat tire was an inconvenience, not a crisis. You jacked up the car, swapped the wheel, tossed the flat in the trunk, and continued your vacation at full speed, fixing the punctured tire whenever it was convenient. Gas station attendants would patch it while you had a sandwich. The retreat began with the Space Saver donut spare in the 1970s and 80s, a skinny temporary tire limited to about 50 miles an hour, adopted because it freed up trunk space and shaved weight for fuel economy standards. Then things got worse. Automakers chasing every tenth of a mile per gallon began deleting the spare entirely, tossing in a can of sealant and a small air compressor instead. And by recent years, roughly a third of new cars in America came with no spare tire at all. That's right, no spare, nothing to swap. Hood ornaments. Once upon a time, you knew a car by the sculpture riding on its nose, the leaping greyhound on a Lincoln, the graceful goddess on a Cadillac, the archer on a Pierce Arrow, the ram's head on a Dodge, the Indian head on a Pontiac, and the rocket-inspired jet ornaments of the 1950s that promised the space age was parked in your driveway. Hood ornaments began life with a practical excuse, decorating the radiator cap that once sat exposed above the grille, and evolved into miniature masterpieces, some designed by genuine artists and even rendered in glowing illuminated glass by Lalique in the 1920s and 30s. So where did they all go? Three assassins did the job. Aerodynamics made every protrusion a fuel economy sin. Pedestrian safety regulations, especially in Europe, made a rigid metal spike on the hood a legal liability, forcing designs that folded or broke away. Next time, the topic is yours. Tell us down in the comments what you want us to bring back, and the comment with the most likes is the one we make. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it.
Sa region na merong ganitong facility o bahay pag-asa, pwede mong puntahan na ang gastos sa pamasahe, amin. Yung staff ninyo